For those who are unable to attend our live events, we encourage you to email questions or comments before or after the sessions to translationclinics@centerforfiction.org. We hope to make these conversations ongoing to include viewers in as many time zones as possible. Now let's dive in. Today, we have the absolute pleasure to hear from Mui Poopoksakul. Mui is a lawyer turned translator with a special interest in contemporary Thai literature. Her translations include 3 story collections, The Sad Part Was and Moving Parts, both by Prabdas Yun, and Arid Dreams by Dunwad Pimwana. She is also the translator of Pimwana's novel Bright. Currently, she is translating a novel by Sanches, a native of Bangkok who spent 2 decades in the US. She now lives in Berlin, Germany. So she is remarkably still awake and cogent. Today, we'll discuss some of the things that can be so confusing about publishing your work in translation, in particular for translators for quote unquote smaller languages, where there's not already a whole system in place. We will also address the role of the translator in shepherding an uncertain author through the process and what a healthy translator-author relationship can look like. Hello, Mui. Thank you for coming and for staying up until, at least an hour past my bedtime to talk with us.
Hi, Julie.
I thought a good place to start would be from the beginning. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you came to your languages and what led you to work in translation and branching from that literary translation, since there's a whole other world of translation out there.
So I'm Thai, so I translate from Thai, of course. So, and as you mentioned, I used to be a lawyer, but I think on some level I always knew it wasn't something I was going to do forever. And I did study comp lit as an undergrad, and I think had I been a braver young woman right out of college, I think I might have pursued something like translation sooner. But so I guess I had sort of like a 1/3 life crisis at some point, and so did a lot of soul searching. And it dawned on me one day. It was like, there's so little translated from Thai. I can do this. I'm totally probably slightly delusional at the point because I had no idea what to do, how to start or anything. And so I decided to switch careers, and I went back to grad school. I went to the American University in Paris. They had a translation program, a master's back then, and I did that. And so that's how I switched careers. And I wanted to pursue literary translation to begin with, if I did any kind of translation at all, to answer your question about that, because I think, I had a well-paying job, so I didn't need a different job that was, I wanted to do something that I was passionate about. And so I think that having come from a career where, I worked, first of all, in an office environment, if you had a question about how something worked, you can just skip down the hall, ask a colleague, ask your boss, ask your assistant, whatever. Coming to translation and now working alone at home, it can get quite, mystifying. And also, in the legal field, I was a deal lawyer on Wall Street. And so the first thing you want to know when you mark up a contract is, what's market, what's so-called market for this kind of contract, this kind of deal, meaning like, what's the market expectation? And coming into translation, I knew none of that. And it was just like going into the wilderness, because I'm just so used to having precedents and all of that. And so, it was quite, and still is quite daunting.
And were you taught any of the sort of practical aspects of being a translator during your master's, or was it much more focused around craft?
It was actually, the course was actually called cultural translation. So we did a fair amount of literary theory, including translation theory. We did have some workshop classes, and for those we translated from French. For my thesis, I translated the book that became my first published translation.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about, sort of taking your first project as a window into some of the practicalities of translating from Thai, as opposed to other languages, which I can talk about a bit later, since I translate from 2 major as opposed to minor. I don't quite know what exact terms to use that aren't like terribly offensive.
I'd say for now agented versus unagented languages, maybe.
Maybe. But yeah, so how was the process of, well, what was that book and how was the process of getting that book to find a publisher?
So I think one of the things that, allowed me to be brave enough to pursue translation was that I had a book in mind to begin with. It was a book that by the story collection by Pravda Yun was like the talk of the town. The 1 year I did live in Thailand as an adult, like between college and law school. And I read that book and it got me really interested in Thai literature, contemporary literature in particular. So I had a book in mind and, I didn't know what I was doing. And to reach him, at the time he owned a bookstore, I dropped by and like dropped off this really nerdy essay that I wrote about his book and left my contact information and just hope for the best. And then I left for Paris, and just before school started, he actually emailed me. So yeah, so he was like, sure, go ahead. And I was like, oh my God, like, I can't believe it. He's just, this like icon of like Thai literature just emailed me. And so that's how I, worked out the rights with him eventually when it got to that point. And I guess I got lucky in many levels along the way because while I was working my thesis, I submitted one story to Asymptote, and they published it. That was my first published translation. And then on sort of a school trip, we went to the London Book Fair, and I ended up standing next to Deborah Smith. And she was a student at the time, and my professor at AUP introduced us. And at the time, she hadn't started Tilted Axis Press yet, but she was thinking about it, I believe. And then when she decided to do it, she emailed me and was like, that book you were telling me about, send it to me. And so I did, and that's how my first project happened. And so yeah, I mean, I feel like a lot of things went right for me, like sort of accidentally, but I tried to learn from the experience as well. But because I do feel like there was a fair amount of luck involved, like working on the next book and the next book, I just never felt completely certain as to how things really work still. But yeah.
And how did the second book differ from, I mean, the first one, you happened to stand next to Deborah Smith, which is extremely fortunate since she, for those of you who don't know Tilted Axis, she runs a press that focuses on publishing Asian literature and translation. And it came out of a sort of, she saw a lack in the market, that not enough was being published from Asia in English. And so Tilted Axis was created. And now I work as their foreign rights agent.
Yeah.
But so like, were there any fortuitous circumstances that led to book number 2, or was it a bit more of the grind?
Well, I think a bit of both. So I think the biggest thing about translating from a quote unquote like smaller language is that you, as a translator, you're going to be the one pitching the book. Like you'll be the one who finds the author that you want to translate and the book that you think deserves to get out there. And so that's a lot of, pre-work, if you will. And I mean, and that involves also contacting authors. And so that part of the work I do kind of enjoy, even though it takes quite a lot of scrappiness. Like I've, gone to the bookstore to look for Pravda. I've written an author who doesn't have email, snail mail. And I mean, it's just like really a lot. It's just because you're sort of the person who's like bringing everyone together. And, I've never worked on a project where, that comes with a publisher attached. So I'm doing all of that alone and in the beginning. So I think that's something that's maybe different from your experience working from Portuguese and Spanish, right? In Catalan.
Yeah. So just to give a brief overview to sort of illustrate this contrast, my first book project came out of essentially a translation summer school where And Other Stories held a competition between the small group of Portuguese language translators. And we all translated an excerpt from this one book called Now and at the Hour of Our Death by Susana Moreira Marques. And there was no publication guarantee, and there was nothing no money attached to it. It was just more like a pat on the back. Well done, you won, congratulations. But they did eventually acquire that book and hire me to translate it. And this press, which was also formed with the aim of publishing more work in translation, does publish a lot. I was fortunate in that three of the editors at the time actually spoke Portuguese. But yeah, after that, a lot of the projects, I'd say the majority of the projects I do come to me through the publisher or through the agent, because a lot of Spanish-speaking literature, Hispanic literature and Lusophone literature has representation. And so, I mean, you're still wearing a ton of different hats. You're just, you also have support from a structure, which is something we discussed before. Like, you moved from a space with rules and regulations and precedents and this whole scaffolding to the lawless world of literary translation, where even in terms of contracts, there are no industry standards. We're still trying to build that from the ground up. I wonder, though, one disadvantage of translating from Spanish to Portuguese is that they're completely overcrowded languages. So I might fall in love with this project to find out that 5 other people have also fallen in love with this project. Are there advantages to translating from, maybe we can call it an underrepresented language in Anglophone publishing?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, I mean, if I find a book, I haven't run into a situation where book already has a different translator attached to it. And also, one really big upside is that I'm always working on something I really love, you know, because I'm the one who picks the book. So that's a really big thing, because, you know, you do so much for the book from start to finish. So, I mean, it's gotten to a point where I just don't even know if I can translate a book I don't love. Someone does actually one day decide to come to me with such a book. But yeah, so that's something I've just gotten so used to. But in terms of the pitching, I don't know if there are somewhat new translators out there, but like something that I think is helpful is when working with a new author, I think it's really helpful to try to place a piece with a journal first before you do a book pitch. I think then it makes your pitch more substantial. And so I found that to be really helpful, and to sort of like sometimes work out the author's voice, give yourself time to work out the author's voice as well. And yeah, so I find that to be really helpful. And let's see, what else do I want to say? Yeah, I guess I still do myself have a lot of questions about pitching, like in terms, like when you pitch a book, like what's the normal number of presses to pitch to, for example, and how much unpaid work you should, how many like unpaid pages should you translate, you know? I mean, I certainly try to make things double count, meaning that the pieces that I try to place with journals will be something that I'm kind of basically trying to make into a sample. So just to make that, so it does twice the work, and so things like that. And yeah, and as I mentioned, I got really lucky meeting Deborah at the book fair, but I do wonder, you know, if I were starting off again, would we want to advise emerging translators who spend money to attend conferences and book fairs and things like that? Because it's quite a gamble, you know. I really don't have an answer to that. Like, I'm not sure. I mean, it's been really helpful for me for sure, but yeah.
I think there have been discussions going on Twitter and other spaces where translators gather to fetch and also give each other support about whether or not pitching works at all, because we do tend to tell emerging translators pitch. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of like throwing pasta at the wall and hoping it sticks. And you know, it's frustrating, but we keep coming back to that same point. Like there's no scaffolding for literary translation. Right. There's no, not even for the craft, as far as I'm aware. Like there is no, this is how you translate this series of words together, right. Because the translator's favorite responses. It depends on the context.
Right.
But I wonder if you could tell us a bit about where you've been able to find support for these questions. Like, have you called a friend, or are there other spaces where you've found that you can get at least some of the answers to the questions you're looking for?
For sure. I mean, I guess when Jeremy invited me to do this talk, I was actually emailing him about rates because I still have so many questions. And so, I reach out to translator friends for sure, to sort of compare notes and things like that. But it's definitely like, looking back, we have a slight chicken and egg problem, because if you have not published anything before, it's hard to get to know other translators, So, but once you do, then you will end up meeting other translators. So, and I think that you often meet people who are like around the same stage of their careers, and then you can compare notes and not feel like completely silly or things like that. But yeah, for sure. I mean, talking to other translators is the most helpful thing. And now you and I are in the BIPOC caucus, which I found really helpful. To share information there. And let's see, I'm in a writing group in Berlin. We're on hiatus at the moment, but that's been also really helpful. And I'm sort of a sporadic social media user, but I think Twitter can be helpful, if you sort of look here and there, see what conversations are going on, what people are saying. So I think Twitter also helps in that regard, although I'm not always super active.
This other question has to do with, again, pulling from experience. When I have questions about books that I'm translating from Brazil specifically, my network to ask is my family, like cousins and possibly other authors that I've translated. Having grown up at least part of your life in Bangkok, who do you end up seeking support from? Is it other translators of Thai literature into English, or is it your grandmother?
You mean in terms of like the language, or like what?
Yeah, language or style or idiom or.
I haven't talked to too many other Thai translators about the actual translation, because there aren't so many of us. But I'm hoping, but there are more people coming up. So I think that that's going to change in the future, which is really exciting. But I often try on my own first, and then if I'm unsure about a phrase, I'll try my family first. We have like a family chat group. I'll throw that out there. And if I sort of question their answer, then I also have other chat groups with like Thai friends, and I'll check it out with them. And then once I've done that, then I'll ask the author to clarify. But yeah, I usually try like friends and family first for sure. Because you look words up in the dictionary and you're like placing the definition in the sentence. I'm like, that doesn't work somehow, like.
That's very familiar. I also have a WhatsApp group with my family in Brazil, and I have my cousins in one. So if there are younger questions, they go to them, and then because my parents left Brazil in the 80s, I know that I can't ask them anything too contemporary or too slangy. We're nearing the midpoint, and I guess if you wished someone had been able to give you a piece of advice when you were, either about to go to the London Book Fair or about to embark on literary translation, I don't know if you were like, this is going to be my career, or I'm just going to give it a shot, but if there was a piece of advice you wish you'd received, can you think of anything?
I think that if I were answering that for an emerging Thai translator, I would say that the biggest thing is to find a book that you really love, because the process is long and you do so much more work than you realize for a book. It's not just translating the book. You start from finding the authors, communicating with them, being the link between them and presses and journals, and through to the publicity. And it's a really long process, and we don't get paid enough for that. So I think that the biggest thing is to really love the project that you're pursuing. So that would be my big piece of advice. And I think on some level I probably knew that, but I think I wish someone had told me that even more clearly. Yeah.
Just sat you down and said, this is the way things are. I know
Yeah.
you have a more romantic version of how things are going to go, but that's not it. Oh God, I had a question at the tip of my tongue and it's gone. I guess, so you're working on something right now. Is that a project that has a publisher or? Yes.
Almost. We're working on contracts at this time. So yes.
Okay. So, and was this an agented project or unagented? Was this mostly you, half an agent?
Oh gosh, this one, oh my God, Julia, it's messy. I don't even know. I think all the parties involved know the situation. So I'm just gonna say. So I started working on this project with Sanches, and he was under the impression that he didn't have an agent anymore. But I mean, he's a genius. I love him, but he's just like the kind of person who doesn't pay attention to details of contracts and such, and he didn't realize that, in order to terminate, for the contract to end, it doesn't end automatically. You need to send a termination notice, and he did not do that. And so he told me that he didn't have an agent. So I pitched a book, and now I feel like really silly. But the agent's been very nice about it because the book got picked up, and then, or basically we're working on contracts. But then at that point I realized it, maybe he needed to terminate. And I mentioned that to him. He's like, oh, no. But then I was like, please look at your contract. And then he's like, oh my God, you're right. And I'm like, I knew it. And so, yeah, so this project has an agent, but I ended up pitching the book unknowingly,
And can you share anything about what the project is, or is it secret?
Oh, no, it's not. It's a novel. This one's a novel, and it's it's the kind of book that I probably wouldn't have thought I would translate when I started translating, because I wanted, when I started working, especially with Pravda, I wanted to translate stories from the timeline that I know, and this one is really not. It is set in the jungle the frame story, it's a story within the story. The frame story is set in the 1960s, but the underlying story is set at the turn of the 20th century. Yeah. So it's about a story of love and loss and revenge. It's about a monk and the fight between his family and this tiger who, according to my analysis, represents like nature striking back against people who are trying to take over the land, basically.
That sounds great. And so this would be your fifth book?
Yeah.
My last question, sort of coming off that, is, I mean, I don't know how many people you've submitted books to, but is there a particular resistance that you think that you get from publishers that would be that, say, like a project from Spanish or French or German would not find that kind of resistance? Like, is there anything that feels like specifically, oh, this is a language that we don't think has a readership? Or
I haven't heard that, but I often just don't hear anything. So I don't know. Sometimes my answer is no answer. So I don't know. It's hard to say. No one has expressed that to me explicitly, and I think that to some extent, probably some publishers have a curiosity about languages that have been translated less. But if they are, worried about these languages not having leadership, no one has expressed it to me. But
I've sometimes, even translating from bigger, using all the wrong terms again, but like languages with agents, I sometimes get resistance from people saying, but this is not the Brazil that I'm used to seeing. And editors wanting the books that I translate to conform more to either the Brazil that is already in their imaginary, or the Mexico, or the Spain, etc. So I wondered if maybe there was some of that, but then again, if there's a lack of response.
There's not so much, Thai literature out there yet, so I haven't heard that. But in my first few projects, I really wanted to lean into a more urban Thailand, like something very contemporary. And the reason why I said the book that I'm translating now is something that maybe I wouldn't have been drawn to when I first started, is that, this book, if you don't read it carefully, can sort of convey an exotic Thailand, which is I'm so against that idea. But but actually the book, if you read it, it's actually quite anti-colonial. And the author told me that he wrote the story, it's basically based on, to some extent, I mean, it's a very fantastical story, but to some extent some of the characters are based on his family. So I think that if somebody was actually born in the jungle, they ought to be able to tell their story. So I've just stopped worrying about that. If you think that if you read a book like this in exotic Thailand, and I think that's on you, so I'm just gonna not worry about it. Yeah.
That's a good way to look at it. Something else that struck me that you were saying about this book in particular is how it actually is about a Thailand that you're unfamiliar with. And I feel sometimes that because, again, I translate from Brazil, there's this idea that I will know intimately every book, like the context of every book that comes out of Brazil, just because I'm from there and my family's from there. Mm-hmm. But the more I translate Brazilian literature, the more I realize how very limited my experience of the country has been. Mm-hmm. I'm working on something right now with Bruna Dantas Lobato, which is based in Ceará, which is a region I've never been to, and a region where the dialect is extreme. Well, not the dialect, but the kind of Portuguese they speak is very different to mine. And I sometimes forget the vastness of that country.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, this book has made me realize how little I know about large parts of Thailand. I mean, the flora and fauna in this book is just crazy. I'm constantly Googling stuff. I don't know any of the trees that he's talking about. I can basically identify like an oak, a maple, and like a coconut tree because I'm from the city, and I'm constantly Googling, and then you come up with a scientific name and you're like, oh God, what is the English name? What's the common name? And it just, very research intensive.
I just delivered a book that's from a place I've never been to. It's set in the Canary Island. And, in an ideal translation world, I might be able to get someone to pay me to go there and spend some time there translating the book. But instead, I spent close to an hour and a half just picking random streets on Google Street View and like wandering up the streets. And I did a lot of what you were talking about, looking up. She uses a lot of very specifically Canarian terms for flora. So I would have to like try to figure out what that was, find the scientific name, through the scientific name, find the English name, and hope that there was something that didn't
sound completely crazy, right? Yeah, totally there. I hear you.
All right. So this is, we are entering the Q&A portion of the clinic. So we invite you to turn your camera on if you would like. To repeat, if you're comfortable speaking on screen, raise your hand either by clicking at the bottom of the participants list or by using the reactions button, and you'll be invited to unmute your microphone and ask the question yourself. If you prefer for Sean to read your question for you, just send it privately to Cedilla in the chat. We'll try to get to all of them, but we apologize in advance if we run out of time. So Sean, I think you said there was one question already?
Yeah. We have a question here from Jeffrey, who asks, at a basic level, is the first step to identify a piece or author you'd like to translate and contact them to negotiate rights before starting to translate or submit it to journals, etc.?
Sorry, the question was, do I talk rates with them before I submit? Was that the question?
The question is the first step to identify a piece or author you'd like to translate and contact them to negotiate rights, like translation rights.
Yeah. So, this is something I feel. So I definitely contact the author and let them know that I'm interested in translating a book and with their book, and would they be okay with that? And so far, everyone's been really excited about it. And so, but of course, I don't ask them. I haven't asked them to sign to promise me the rights, but But so it's, I mean, I do think that we all sort of put ourselves in a slightly precarious situation, working the way I do, at least, which is that, you know, you agree to translate a sample or submit their work without them actually legally binding themselves to you. So, I mean, I asked for permission, definitely, but they haven't given me exclusive permission, if you will. I hope that answers the question.
For agented languages, I would also recommend trying to find out who represents them and building a relationship with that person. And sometimes I think it's been helpful to build relationships with the publisher of the book in the original language. I don't know if that's been your experience at all, Moy.
Yeah, actually, my current author, the author that I'm working with now, he happens to be published by the same press as the Noir Pimona, so that worked out really well because the publisher was able to help put me in touch.
I think we have a question from Marcella.
Hello, thank you so much for this workshop presentation. It's amazing. Is so happy. But my question was, I had so many questions, but I'll just start with, I guess, so I have a book in mind that I've started translating at home, and the author is deceased, which I know maybe that's not the best way to start, but I could just tell you it's Jean Amourouche, who's Algerian, and it's Cendre, it's a poetry collection. So I asked L'Harmattan if they had the rights to it, and they do. So I was just kind of curious what you think, once I finished translating it, what I should do, maybe.
Oh, your question just reminded me of one thing. The reason why I've been contacting authors as opposed to publishers, that Thai authors usually own their own rights, hold their own rights. So that's something that's not true in every country. For you, like you said, you contacted the publisher, and I think that yeah, definitely before you do too much more work, I would definitely speak to the publisher and let them know that you're working on it, and would they be okay with you submitting it and all of that, and work all of that out before you proceed. I think that you will make you like mentally more comfortable with the whole thing as well. Yeah.
When an author is deceased as well, if the publisher doesn't have the rights, then the rights will be with the estate, which can be all kinds of messy or can be very straightforward, depending. And the publisher would be able to help you figure that out anyway down the line. So yeah, I think that's usually the case, either publisher or estate.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess my other just follow-up question to that would be, you know, I have background MA in Complet. I was wondering, do you think a translation degree is necessary?
Well, I did one, but I don't think it's necessary. I mean, I think that if you, well, let me back up a little bit. I think I do respond well to reading a certain amount of theory. So if you're able to get yourself to read some of that on your own, then I don't think you need an MA. And you know, if you translate at home and maybe have a few pairs of eyes who can look over the drafts for you and stuff and comment, and I think you wouldn't. I don't think it's necessary. I think it gives you a little bit more confidence, but yeah.
I've heard from, I did an MA in Complet in literary translation, but there was so very, very little literary translation that it didn't really change anything for me, except that I did it in Spain, and so my Spanish got better and I learned Catalan. But I have heard that if you are able to get a spot on the funded MFA in literary translation that Iowa has, that it's a very good program. And maybe another sort of thing to do that isn't doing MA is look at attending Alta if you're in the United States, because you'll make I guess one thing that you could get from an MA is the relationship. I don't know if that was the case with you, Mui, but so you might be able to get that from Alta, the American Literary Translators Association conference.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
It looks like we have a question in the chat. Is that the one that you're talking about, Sean? Lots of written questions.
We have a bunch of questions in the chat. So I'll start at the beginning. From Lily, this is another rights question. How do you obtain copyright permissions for work by deceased authors? She says, I'm interested in a Moroccan Arabophone writer who passed away in 2001. He has no descendants. I've emailed the publishers and have not received a response. I'm not sure what else to try. Is this a lost cause, or do you have any advice?
I mean, I have no experience working with deceased authors. I mean, I think I would, try every way to find out who the executor of the estate is, but I've not faced that situation before, I'm afraid. Yeah. I guess definitely determine who holds rights between the state and the publisher.
I am not clear on this, but it might be in the Authors Guild contract, or maybe this happened during some session we did about contracts, but I think there is such a thing as proving that you've done your best to figure out who the rights holder is and then apologizing for it later. Like if you can prove that substantial efforts were made to contact the rights holder, that you tried the publisher, that you tried X, Y, and Z, then you might be covered. I think you just have to have a paper trail of having tried to do that. It's always quite sad to declare a project a lost cause just because sort of the paper trail is thin or non-existent. So I wouldn't say it's a lost cause. Maybe try universities or other writers as well. They might also have information because literary communities can be quite small. Even in an enormous country like Brazil, most of the writers know each other.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
So we have a question here from Pan, who says, thank you for your wonderful talk. I'm now a Chinese student working on translation studies. You've mentioned an agent several times. I have a silly question. What role does an agent play in the process of publishing literary work? I hardly noticed this role before, and I thought translators collaborated with editors directly. Could you please give me a clearer idea?
Well, I don't know if I should take this question because I have very little experience working with agents. So my answer would be more like what you do that's agent-like. So maybe I should let you answer this and then I can go from there. If you'd like to hear how it works when there is no agent.
I mean, I also know that things work differently in different countries. And if I'm not mistaken, there are rights agencies in China that will hire translators to do samples or sometimes translate entire books. Jeremy would be more in a position to answer that. I'll sort of talk broadly, and if Jeremy wants to talk about to the question of agents in China specifically, but an agent is the author's representative. So they're like the liaison between the publisher and the author, and they sort of came to be because authors' rights had to start being protected. If you look at contracts from way back in the day, I think Ralph Ellison got $500 for The Invisible Man. And so agents came along, and publishers would keep copyright forever, which took the rights completely out of the author's hands. And so agents are negotiating on behalf of the author. Where translators come in, the agent will, if they do say represent there are lots of agents working with Spanish language writers, so I'll just use that as an example. Like Brazil has far fewer of them. If there's a book that I decide I want to translate, or like to translate a sample of and start pitching, then I can reach out to the author. It's hard to reach out to every party involved, but I reach out to the author and then I reach out to the agent, because the agent might be doing the same work you're doing, which is pitch the book around, because their job is to get the book published as widely as possible, or at least one of their jobs. They also review royalty statements and negotiate contract points. And there are advantages and disadvantages to working with agents. One advantage being that if the agent is on board for the project, they can do all of the work and you just like translate a sample to help and hope it goes well. The disadvantage is the agent doesn't decide who translates the book. So if it gets to the publisher and then the editor is like, actually, this person is way more famous and I've worked with them before, then they can commission someone else to translate it, which is very heartbreaking. But Jeremy, do you want to, sorry to put you on the spot, but would you want to tell us a bit about how it works in China?
Well, in some countries, including China, rights agents are also able to access government funding, in which case they can pay for the translation of samples or even entire books, which they will then pitch to publishers in the English-speaking world. So the agent kind of is the person facilitating and funneling that funding where it's needed, i.e. to the translator. And then it's out of your hands. In these situations, in China at least, it's often a work for hire, so the translator doesn't really retain copyright or have any say as to where the work gets published. So it's not for everyone, but it can be an effective way of having an entire translation to pitch to publishers, which makes it much more likely to get the book out, even if you're not the one doing the pitching.
Are we ready for another question?
Sure, unless Mui wants to add anything.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh no, I mean, I guess that I mean, my only thing is I think that when there's no agent involved, you do a lot of the similar work, you know, like the pitching. And I mean, for myself, I feel like sometimes that's the part that gets a little bit stressful, because I feel like I'm the one, you know, dragging my authors into this whole process. And I feel like, you know, every journal, every press you send their work to, I mean, there's a level of trust, and there's like, I feel like almost like a fiduciary duty to my authors. And yeah, I would love to have a wonderful agent to work with. So.
Thank you. So Allegra asks, could you recommend some articles for theory?
Well, I also teach a little bit, like in Thailand, a translation master's, and the book that I always recommend to my students is There a Fish in Your Ear? Or in my ear, which was now I can't even remember, by David Bellows. So I really like that book.
Oh dear, I've read some theory, but I'm really bad at remembering. I actually found Kate Briggs's This Little Art really helpful in sort of placing the act of translation in, like, connecting it to personhood, because we often like forget that there are real people making decisions, and sort of troubling the idea of what translation is supposed to do. But I don't know if that counts as theory, because it's like a very pleasant, almost memoir-like work as well. That's really great. And there's some, I mean, Venuti is an author that a lot of people read for his for discussions on domestication versus foreignization. And I will try to think of more and possibly put it in the chat. But is there, yeah, it's challenging to think of these things. Translators' notes are also really great places to see how decisions are reached, and even like sort of extrapolate theory from that.
Yeah, and even just you know, essays by translators in journals when they write about their most recent translation or whatever, you get a lot of theory out of those. I think you can extrapolate quite a lot.
Am I muted? No, I'm not. Our next question is from Alex. Could you talk about the role of grants in the translation of novels and their publication, specifically with an eye to languages that are unagented or less represented in English translation?
So, gosh, I've had very little luck with grants from Thailand, and by very little, I mean none. I just applied for another grant to do 3 samples, and from the Thai Ministry of Culture, and I haven't heard back at all. Like, they didn't even say no, they just didn't reply. It's very upsetting. And yeah, I've been in conversation with people from the ministry, and they seem supportive, but then I just haven't had any funding from Thailand at all. My first 2 translations that I did with Tilted Axis, they were funded by English Pen. So I won 2 grants through that, but I've had no luck with Thailand at all.
Have you applied for Penheims or NEA, Molly?
Yeah, I applied this year.
Yeah. Well, fingers crossed.
NEA is only for American citizens and residents, so which I'm not. I think that's right? NEA is only for
the NEA is, yeah, the Penheim is open to anyone. Was that our last question, Sean? Oh,
that was our last written question. But if folks have more, feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat. We still have some time.
We do have like say 5 minutes, because then I have the difficult question to pose that we always end with. Jeremy.
Hi, Wei. I was interested because we were talking about small versus large languages, which seems to boil down to which languages readers have a context for, or publishers think readers have a context for, and with the assumption that they won't read anything that they don't already know. Because I have the experience of translating from a large language, Chinese, but a small country, Singapore, and successfully pitching work from China and Taiwan, but so far not yet Singapore, except 2 publishers in Singapore. So I wonder, how can we break this vicious circle? And if there's any mileage in some kind of regional representation, in terms of, for instance, talking about Southeast Asian literature, which isn't really thought of as a block the way, say, Latin American literature is.
You know, I really do think that presses like Tilted Axis, you know, with a focus that kind of having something with a focus on the region would really help. Like, even I've been thinking, like, you know, if you get agents who focus on the region, that would really help a lot. And but I've not had a lot of luck with agents in terms of, like, you know, someone will ask me about an author that they don't represent, but then no one ever commissions a sample by an author that they don't already represent. So like, I just don't, I feel like, yeah, I feel dead-ended very often on this, you know. But, you know, with the things that we're doing with the BIPOC caucus, for example, I just feel like if we can sort of band together and sort of, you know, form a block of some sort to sort of drum up interest, that would help, you know. So
I wonder if it's also worth trying to create relationships between agents and some of the presses, because, or like, for example, Hunford Star has just been formed in Korea, and they publish books, translations from Asia, and a mutual friend of ours is going to start representing that press, so that to like bridge, to make the connection between this small press in Asia and the United States. And I wonder if some more of those connections, but I like the idea of sort of framing it as something a bit more graspable, possibly for this. I don't know, people think of readers as extremely unchanging and slow-minded, apparently. But that's an interesting thought.
Yeah, it's definitely, I mean, Jeremy, it's a question that I think about a lot. And honestly, I don't have a good enough answer. That's my honest answer. Like I think about it a lot, and I still don't know what really to do, you know? Like,
is there a way to put together a project and seek funding from multiple government bodies for this kind of thing so that they're working together? Or would that just make it even more complicated because government bodies are challenging to work with?
Actually, I think Singapore might actually have some funding, right, for Southeast Asian languages. I think I looked into it once, but I haven't looked into it recently.
I mean, as the Asymptote saga has told us, the Singapore Arts Council is primarily interested in funding Singaporean literature. But there might be specific Southeast Asian funds, which maybe we should look into.
I support this endeavor. Okay, I think we're running out of time, and I'll move on to our final big scary question, or possibly idealistic question. Moi, what would an ideal future of literary translation look like to you?
You know, like this, my answer is going to suggest a super duper long game, because something I think about from time to time is, you know, when I was back in school, in middle school and high school, you'd read translations, and the fact of these books being translated books were just never highlighted. And I think that if we were able to get educators to talk about translation when they're teaching a translated book, to highlight this fact, you know, to have our labor recognized, I think that could really, my dream is that I think it would do a lot. I think it would do a lot for our industry, because you would get people used to the idea of reading translation, valuing our labor, and, you know, maybe more people would be interested in, more of like different kinds of people would be interested in translating, and people like all the different players in the industry would grow up like appreciating this work, and also readers would get more accustomed to the idea that translation is actually a really big part of their reading life. And I think that, so yeah, my short answer is, I think, you know, try to get them while they're young and impressionable.
I love that. I like that a lot. It makes me think of how we used to take dubbed movies for granted and think that dubbed movies were the way to go. And now suddenly we have convinced a whole swath of people that reading subtitles is actually okay. So it's the same. Thinking that there's a translator involved in a text is actually okay.
Yeah, because I mean, definitely me as a young person, you know, when you read Proust, you thought you were reading Proust, not Moncrief. And it's like, hello, you know, when I think back now, it's just ridiculous. But like, I think that's how most people grow up, you know, what they grow up thinking. And then we just get erased completely. And it's not like I want to be famous or anything. I really don't. But I just think that to have our work recognized, that, you know, the fact of its existence would really help our, like, you know, raise the profile of our profession. So.
As you were saying that, I thought of how, you know, you have the Great British Baking Show, and you also have the Great Pottery Throwdown. You just need one of those, but very, very slow and possibly quite boring for literary translation.
Wow, that would be something.
Anyway, thank you so much. That's all the time we have. Thank you, Moi, for joining us. Thank you to all the participants. Thank you, Jeremy, for letting me put you on the spot, and Sean, and to the Center for Fiction for hosting these clinics. Translation clinics take place on the third Thursday of every month. Please sign up to be notified of upcoming events. Next month, Anton Hoare will talk with Jeffrey Zuckerman about how literary translators can shape their practice according to their beliefs and desires for social change. The registration link is in the chat and on the Center for Fiction's website. We look forward to seeing you again soon, and please continue to stay safe.
Thank you.